Welcome everybody back here at Veil of Sound. And an interview with this guy here, or one of his bands, seems to now become, also at this time of year, a commodity. When you are watching this, it's the 22nd of June. The last interview we did was on the 30th of June. And the interview with his band partner, Brendan, was on the 26th of June in 2022. So June, at the end of June, I always talk to Doug Moore or one of his associates. So Doug, thanks for joining.
Torsten, thank you for having me back again. I can't believe that I'm still welcome on this fine program, but here we are.
You always are. You always are, my friend. And remember, if you ever want to come into writing again, there's always a spot in our staff for you.
I mean, never say never, but
exactly.
Obviously, I have a few balls in the air right now as a musician, so
I know.
As time allows, so.
Yeah, just talk to one of our common friends who also does that once every month.
Right.
Doug, you know the game. We always have like the first thing, like the pluck of the day, as I now thought for myself about christening it, because I see you are wearing a shirt, but I'm also wearing a shirt by Amin Ra, but I want to pluck something else. Do you want to go first? Who do you want to pluck today?
Well, I got the well, are we doing the shirt or are we doing just the random?
Whatever you want to do. Whatever you want.
Okay. Well, I feel like I've plugged. I might have even worn this shirt in a prior interview on Veil of Sound, so I'll go for the choice album. It's Hammers of Misfortune.
No, you didn't.
Okay, I didn't. Okay, I thought I was putting this shirt on this morning, and I was like, have I worn this shirt on a Veil of Sound interview before? Apparently not, but there's been enough that I wasn't sure. In any case, the album I would plug is by a band called Glass, with an accent on the A. It's GLA with an accent SS, and they have a self-titled album that came out earlier this year. They are, I guess you would call them, a noise rock band, or maybe a prog band. They're kind of somewhere in between those things. They're from South Carolina, and it's like this really unique, long form, it's kind of like this noise rock, prog rock, indie rock fusion thing. The way the songs are structured is they all kind of flow into each other as though you were like changing channels on a radio or something like that. They have a really cool vocal and lyrical presence where the guy's often he can sing and stuff, but he's also kind of muttering and raving and ranting a lot. And it's not metal, it's not heavy in that way, but it has a very ominous atmosphere. And it really has like a certain quiet kind of intensity to it. And the album it's pretty long. It's like 60 or 70 minutes.
Okay.
And so there's a lot to unpack in there. And I've been listening to it really compulsively recently. It's like one of my favorite albums this year. And it's sort of a lesser known band. So I really like people to check them out if anyone is intrigued by that description.
So then I'll take the chance and once in a while pluck two things.
Okay.
First of all, I like to plug the upcoming Kaspar Brötzmann record because it's just amazing and the guy is fantastic. And maybe I also use it to give you a little hint at why you should be watching this channel in the next upcoming weeks.
Oh, nice.
And I go along with the same label, the wonderful Exile on Mainstream label, because a few weeks ago they put out a wonderful record by a band called Carla Kult. And it's heavy, it's melodic, it's cool, so everybody should check out Carla Kult. And I'm not sure when the Brötzmann record is coming out, either shortly before this or after, but you definitely should check out those two records on Exile on Mainstream. Give my friend Andreas a shout when you order, he'll always love it. So, but I, of course, want to talk with you about the new record, Convalescence Agonies. How many?
It's
how many
Convalescence.
does it sound?
Yeah. Singular Convalescence.
Okay.
Convalescence Agonies. Yeah.
But wait, doesn't it then say on one of the promos with a, on one of the promos, on Bandcamp, it's definitely correct. But now I got it. In one of the promos, it says Convalescence Agonies. So Convalescence Agonies.
Convalescence Agonies, yes.
Yes. Out since the end of May on Eidvoyanger Records. And I guess that the first thing that everybody would ask is why 6 years? We'll come to the why 6 years. But I thought of something else to start with, and that is something that took me by surprise when I saw the cover of a record. Is it intentional that the record has a rose on it, which looks like one of the roses from the War of the Roses in England?
Yeah, so the it's called a Tudor rose.
Exactly.
Right. And
Which combined the Lancaster and York roses from before.
Right, exactly. That's a deliberate choice. I wouldn't say that it's a super symbolically freighted choice, but sort of as to why that appears on the album cover, there's roses mentioned in the lyrics, like on the first song. And then when we were trying to determine a visual direction for this album, who I've worked with a lot for many of my projects. She's my partner. So she kind of was around for the entire creative process of the record. And the two prior records we had gone this kind of like very literal art direction where it was like images of wounds sort of rendered as though they were like topographical maps, right? That was kind of the first two recordings. I knew I wanted to do something different for this one. And so as we were kind of trying to work out what kind of image to pursue for this one, we kind of came to the conclusion that we wanted to do something that incorporated sort of the imagery of like Christian religious iconography to some degree, and kind of like the especially illuminated manuscripts that were created by monks. And so that kind of became like the seed of the idea. And Caroline had a really strong interest in that era of European art, and just has like a large vocabulary of understanding of images, of that kind. And so basically kind of just turned her loose on it, and she came up with the idea of using the Tudor rose, because also another thing that we both of us really like on album covers is kind of these radial patterns, and it's a really beautiful radial pattern. I think basically the way that it worked out was that she had been wanting to do something like this anyway. And then the opportunity arose to do it for this specific band. And so there's kind of a few of them. If like when you get the physical object, there's a few of those Tudor roses throughout the layout. But yeah, that's exactly what that is.
And she also drew or painted you and Steve in a style which could be something like a late medieval style in a way.
Yeah. That's also very intentional, that's like kind of the band photo for this cycle.
Exactly.
And we did that for a couple of reasons. One is just because we thought it would be really cool to have an illustration of the band. You don't see that very often.
Yeah.
And Caroline likes to do portraiture. And so she was like, well, what if I just painted you guys? And then additionally, also like there's something, it's kind of a pragmatic decision as well, because we kind of got pretty far into the process of putting together the album layout. And then we kind of realized we didn't have a band photo. And Steve plays in Pyrrhon, so I see him in person somewhat regularly, but he lives in Philadelphia, which is a couple hours away from here. I live in New York. Basically it was just kind of around the holidays when this was happening. It was sort of inconvenient for us to get together and do a band photo. And kind of additionally, like, Steve and I don't love doing the band photos. It's just like a part of the process. One has to do. Yeah. So we weren't like super enthusiastic about going and getting a band photo taken. So Caroline was like, well, what if I just paint you guys? And that's part of the layout. And we were like, great, sounds awesome. So that was also her initiative. And I really like it. I think it's a pretty unique part of the visual iconography for this record. So.
And I'm not sure if that's just me interpreting it into it, but sometimes when I looked at the lyrics, which is always important when talking with you, sometimes I had the feeling as if there was some kind of strange early modern English lyricism in there. Probably not intentional, but if I look at, for example, Arctic Summer, there are words in there that normal people nowadays just don't use. I know we've already talked about that last time, but that misbegotten flower, seeded in spring with blind hope by a longing, lustful gardener.
Yeah, I mean, I actually am doing that somewhat intentionally. Like it's meant to sound kind of archaic.
Yeah.
And that just kind of comes from, I guess, my own personal background, like early in my life when I was getting into writing and getting into sort of reading stuff that had a poetic cast. A lot of the early stuff that I read was like 19th century, like romantic poetry. But I also at the time,
which in itself was, as we have to explain to people who don't know it, which in itself was again already influenced by 16th century English, of course.
Right, exactly. It was kind of, that was also meant to be archaic for its own time, right? But also for a while in sort of like my teens and early 20s, I had sort of a literary interest in the King James Bible. I'm a totally secular person. I don't believe in Christianity or any other religion at all, but it's a really remarkable document with a lot of beautiful language in it. And I think that there's something about that type of phrasing that in my mind is appropriate for the sounds that Weeping Sores is making. Just kind of this sense of being at the mercy of larger forces and just kind of being batted around by fate and, having to endure hardships and tragedy in sort of a stoic way. There's kind of this like sort of archaic moral sentiment in the band that I think that language evokes, at least for me, in a subconscious way, right? This like connection between that style of phrasing and sort of the sort of dour beauty of a lot of that type of writing and that type of sort of the kinds of stories that are told in that kind of writing. So that is like something that I'm not trying to like make it too explicit or use like really really archaic. I'm not saying thee and thou and stuff like that, but but it's meant to like have echoes of that, right? So you're totally right that that's there.
And of course, that also once again plays into the cover artwork, and it's like another bridge from medieval illustration of, for example, the W in Weeping Sores, and then this is like a lyrical transition, a little bit more into the present. And however, when thinking about the record, time also, to me at least, seems to be of real essence in understanding the record, because I mean, first of all, you refer to seasons, you refer to certain times in a year, you refer to the time also in itself. Has time on this record played a more pronounced role for you when you wrote the lyrics?
Yeah, I think definitely yes. And in a way, even more like it kind of, I wrote the lyrics like now a couple of years ago. And the album is only now coming out, right? Like I wrote the lyrics mostly in, I guess it was 2022 and early 2023. And now it's 2025. And in a way, like the connection to time and the passage of time with this album has only become more pronounced since I finished writing the lyrics. Because this album took so long and because it was something that I largely pursued alone, essentially. This is being a record where I'm playing most of the instruments and kind of was in charge of at least like directing the arrangements and stuff like that. A lot of the work was pursued here in this room that I'm speaking in. And often, as a matter of regular practice for a long time, as I was like, becoming able to play the parts. And then sort of, working with those to develop the lyrics and just the entire process, so much of it was spent just like day after day in the same place, doing the same thing while the world continued to move on around me, right? And so it was something that was very much on my mind during the instrumental conception of the record was how long things were taking. And we can like get into that, like why that happened when we're ready to do that. But yeah, that was the sense of pursuing this process for a long stretch of time while things change around me and while I myself also changed is something that's really baked into this record at a very, very, a deep level, right? It's like something that's one of the most foundational parts of the record, I would say.
So you've already hinted it. So let's come straight at it. 6 years since False Confessions. You want to explain why it took so long, or shall I start?
I mean, I can just kind of lay it out relatively quickly. I mean, first of all, like as just a background condition of this band, I am in a bunch of other bands. Steve, the drummer, is in a bunch of other bands.
Sometimes with you.
Yeah, mostly with me. And we both have, professional day jobs, right? Like 9-to-5 type day jobs. And as a consequence, a lot of our time is occupied already. And this is something that we kind of pursue as we're able. I would say that like the band that takes scheduling priority is Pyrrhon, because Pyrrhon is like a touring band, right? Whereas our other bands are things that we kind of are able to do with the time that we have available, and that has to kind of conform to the other things that are in our lives, right? So like, just like kind of from the jump, this is a project that's going to move relatively slowly, no pun intended.
Also works with the music,
right?
No
exactly,
pun intended.
Right. So basically, that was like kind of the background condition. But the primary reason that things took so long, I would say, well, there's really two reasons, right? The first reason is that while working on the prior Weeping Sores recording, and specifically during the actual tracking, I sustained a serious injury to my right shoulder. It was basically an overuse injury that mostly occurred because of the way I was lifting weights, but also I think was a function of the fact that I was practicing a lot to prepare for that recording, right? It was an injury to my rotator cuff, which is the network of tendons that keep the top of your arm in your shoulder and basically like stabilize it.
Yeah, nowadays a normal NFL injury, if I may add.
Yeah, there's it's a really common football injury. Mine is, oftentimes in sports like that, you'll see like a torn rotator cuff, right? Yeah. And a torn rotator cuff, that's bad. It's a muscle tear, but you can fix it with surgery. In my case, I had a tendon injury that was, I guess they call it a tendinopathy, or tendinosis sometimes. The terminology tends to kind of vary depending which doctor you're speaking with. But it's a degenerative injury, right? Like, so basically my tendons were being a little damaged by exercise, which is like, that's normal. That's what you want. And then I was kind of overusing them and not letting them recover enough, so they didn't heal correctly. And that kind of happened over and over and over again until they were just kind of fucked up. And like, all the fibers in the tendons were like all at odd angles and stuff like that. If you look at them with like an MRI. And that injury, you can't fix it with surgery. There's nothing you can do from a surgical perspective because there's no tear. What you need to do is kind of gradually break down the tendon tissue using physical therapy and then let it heal correctly, which is a very time-consuming process. Like First, I would say that like this injury was pretty serious. I really couldn't use my right arm for most things. I couldn't play guitar, first of all, but even like more basic things like, I like to cook. I couldn't really like cut vegetables with that arm because there was so much pain and the shoulder was so weak that like I had to, like I'm right-handed. I had to use my left hand for all these things. So it was, the only thing I could do basically was anything with my arm like dangling in a neutral position. I could do things with like my hand and my lower arm, but anything that required me to go like this, like initially even putting on a shirt was hard to do. Like it was really bad. So I was essentially disabled, right? And so that meant no guitar, obviously, and no lifting weights, and a lot of things in my life were like pretty seriously disrupted by this. And so, as I entered the physical therapy process, I wasn't sure whether I was ever going to be able to play guitar again, because these injuries, you can recover from them to a degree, but in most cases, especially if you're older, I was, in my early 30s already when this happened. If you're older, the chances are it's not going to ever be the same, right? Like you will lose some functionality like permanently. So at the outset of the process, I was like, well, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to play guitar again, but I'd like to try. So when working with physical therapists, I would say like, my priority, it's like lifting weights. I love to lift weights, but I really care about playing guitar. So let's like focus on rehabbing for that kind of functionality. Right. So eventually after, a long stretch of time, I think it was probably about the first 6 months of the physical therapy process, they were like, okay, you should start trying to play guitar again. And I was not able to play the kinds of things that I was playing on the prior Weeping Sores record. I couldn't play a lot of the songs because it hurt. So I started with the goal of I wanted to continue the band because I was happy with that record and it seemed like people were interested in it. So I set a goal for myself, like for my rehabilitation, of writing a new Weeping Sores record. Like this is how you will motivate yourself. It might be slower and simpler than it was previously, but like write something that will give you something to work towards. And at the time, I could play like basically like out of the gate at that juncture, I could play for maybe like 5 minutes at a time before I had to stop. And I had a pretty limited range of techniques. Like I couldn't tremolo pick at all. That's a big part of my guitar playing is I tremolo pick a lot. So basically I was like limited with what kinds of parts I could write initially. And also I just couldn't play for more than a couple of minutes, as I said. And so I basically right away started writing what would become the Convalescence Agonies, the song specifically. The first riff that I wrote was, it's like the long song, and there's about half or 2/3 of the way through, there's like a quiet, clean guitar break. And then there's like a big like haymaker, like chuggy riff after that. And that first heavy riff coming out of the break was the first riff that I wrote for the record and the first riff that I wrote after the injury. And then basically for the next 6 months, as I gradually recovered my ability to play something more like I was able to previously, I just worked on that song. It was only that song for like half of a year. And that's part of why that song became such a monstrosity. It's like this, like it's the longest song I've ever written by a couple minutes. And it's like, it became actually, it's ultimately a pretty, by my standards, technical song. Like it's not super easy to play. But it took like, I've never worked on any piece of music for as long as I worked on that one. And that was kind of like how, by the end of that process, by the next 6 months, like kind of at the end of that year, I was more or less able to play guitar again in a somewhat similar fashion to how I could play previously. And so that song like was my recovery, and by extension, the album more broadly became the way that I retrained my shoulder to be able to play guitar. And over the course of that process, like my creative decisions are pretty similar, but my technique changed. Like I don't play guitar the same way that I used to. I kind of like hold it at a different level, and I palm mute differently from how I used to palm mute. And all these little things change about my mechanics. And that's all kind of captured on this record. So like that by itself, you can imagine that like the rest of the songwriting process was also pretty laborious, right? Like, so there was a very, very long process of learning to play again by writing the music. And then also in the middle of all this happening, that was in 2019, that stretch I just described. And then 2020 rolls around and COVID happens and everyone's lives get upended. And there's all kinds of chaos around that. So that slows things down. And then, 2021, I spent a lot of that time sort of spinning up to the Scarcity record. And Pyrrhon had released a record the prior year that we didn't get to tour on. So we were doing touring things for that. And I was working on the Sepias record, and the Weeping Sores material was kind of just very gradually, evolving, but again, sort of in the background, because I still wasn't able to play guitar for long periods of time at this juncture. I wasn't able to play for more than an hour, I would say, until like mid 2022, when I was about to actually record. I recorded the instrumentals for the Convalescence Agonies that fall. So basically, the plan was at that juncture that we would finish the record in 2023, and then we would try to release it by the end of that year. So in the meantime, on the first two Weeping Sores records, there's a third member, We had a violinist named Gina, right? And so she wrote a bunch of material for the new record, and actually even recorded the material that she had written for it. But then for what people tend to call personal and creative differences, we kind of decided not to pursue like that, and she left the band. And at that juncture, when she left, everything had been recorded. We thought the album was like, being finished with the mixing process and was about to be sent off to the mastering engineer. So she leaves the band, and we take her parts off of the record. And at that juncture, I had to figure out what I was going to do with it, because it wasn't really complete with just the guitar, bass, and drums and vocals.
Yeah. Especially the last part. Yeah, the last song.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of parts where, like in that song especially, I feel like, but even throughout the record, it wasn't written with the intention of just having guitar, bass, and drums into the instrumental palette. So at that juncture, I had to pause and decide whether I was going to finish the album or not. Right. I was like, well, maybe I'm just going to scrap this. Who knows? And at that juncture also, I was preparing to record the second Scarcity record, and Pyrrhon had a recording session scheduled for later that year. So I was like, I need to clear my head with this. Like, it's already been going for a long time. I'm just going to put it on the shelf for a while.
Yeah.
So
if it's 6 years, if it's already 4 years or 5 years, it doesn't matter if it's 5 or 6.
Right. Exactly. At that juncture, I was like, well, I don't know if anyone even remembers that this band exists. This is something that's very important to me. But I don't know, we don't play live or anything like that, right? So who knows? In the metal scene, you get 10 minutes of people's attention, right? And then it's on to the next record. So in a lot of cases, it's easy for people to forget. I totally understand that. So I was like, well, no one's probably really waiting around for this to happen. So I'm just going to shelve it for a while, and maybe I'll come back to it, and maybe I won't. And so at that juncture, I put it on. I set it aside for a bit. I worked on this other material. And basically at a certain point, I kind of just started seeking my friend's counsel, so to speak, and being like, what do you think? Should I keep going with this or not? And they pretty much all said yes. And in fact, a bunch of them offered to help. And they're like, well, if the difficulty is that you want to add more instrumental voices to this, I'm a musician, I'll do some stuff on it, right? So that ended up with a bunch of people who are close friends of mine chipping in various ways. So speaking of Scarcity, all the keyboards on there are Brendan from Scarcity. He's a composer, so he was just so yeah, I can just.
You should be able to do it. Right?
Yeah, right, exactly. I was like, this is your job, and he's like, yeah, it's my job. I can do it. Yeah. So he contributed a bunch. He is the one who connected me with Andy Blythe, the cellist who performs on the record. They actually have an album out together of music that they composed together. It's really, really good. It came out a couple of months ago. I strongly recommend that anyone who's interested in the new Weeping Sores look that up, because you can hear what those two are like in their own domain. It's not a metal record, but it is very heavy. It's a really awesome record.
If you want to find it, we'll put it into the lyrics. Yes.
Thank you. So Brendan brought her in, and then other than that, I'm in this very long running sort of group chat with Lev Slujitel, who quite well as a Veil of Sound contributor. He's also the Sleepwalker man. We can say that now. He gave me permission. I asked him.
So now I can say it publicly. Oh yeah, he's Sleepwalker, not a Walker.
Yeah, right. I was like, how can I want to credit you for your part on the record. How top secret is this? He's like, I think the cat's out of the bag at this point. So
yeah, it wasn't difficult.
Yeah, maybe he'll yell at me for saying that, but he explicitly told me that I can say that now. So left
is sleep token.
Yeah, right. So yeah, he's sleep token, exactly. Things are going great for him right now.
Yes.
But yeah, so with him and Pete Lloyd, who's the guitarist from Replicant, those guys. I've known
another band that you mentioned in our last interview. Yes.
Oh, yeah, because their album had just come out, I think.
Exactly.
And those guys are friends of mine for now a very long time. I've known them both I've known Pete for 16 years, and I've known Lev for 14 years. So near and dear old friends, and they both had been sort of kind of encouraging me throughout this whole process, because at this juncture in the story, I was pretty frustrated with everything, like I had, like been working so hard to rehabilitate my shoulder to be able to play the parts. And then I thought we were near the end of the process and kind of had to go back to the drawing board with it. And, at that time I was like, it was hard. It was emotionally challenging, and they were really supportive of me throughout that. And I will always remember that those guys, had my back in that way. And then they also were like, yeah, well, we can do stuff on the record. So they both have guest spots on the record as well. And just kind of in general, the guy who mixed the record is this guy, Chris Grigg, who is the guy from Woe. He's like the Woe primary composer and songwriter. I'm in another band with him, like a death metal band called Glorious Depravity. And he also really was very supportive.
Which should also be releasing a new record, by the way. It's already been 4 years again.
It's true. Well, that one's done, and more. Stay tuned on that front. There should be news on that before too long.
Yeah, where to premiere it. Remember.
Sure. I mean, well, I don't control that part of the process, but I will kindly suggest that they reach out to you. So he also was like, yeah, you should finish this. Like, this is worth pursuing. And he actually ended up kind of, because after we got to this point, I was like, well, we had to come up with all these new arrangements. It's kind of a different sonic palette, right? Like, a cello is, different frequency range of a violin. All the, actual parts changed. There's the keyboards and all this other stuff. Chris had basically finished the mix prior to this, and he ended up remixing the record essentially to accommodate the new arrangements. But just to give a sense of the chronology here, so we kind of decide at the end of 2023, yes, I will pursue this. So I put together kind of a general plan for the arrangements and started reaching out to people. And it took various contributors various lengths of time to be able to get around to working on it. In the case of Annie, Annie's one of her professional jobs as a cellist is she performs on ensembles that are on cruise ships. So right after I spoke to her about being on the record, she's like, yeah, I'd love to do it, but I'm going to be on the high seas for the next 6 months. And I was like, sure. Sure. I mean, as we have said now, I was not in a rush at this point. I was like, well, it'll happen when it happens. So eventually she comes back, we get her parts in. This is now well into 2024. We finish the mix, get it mastered in late summer 2024. At this point, I finally email I Voidhanger, and I'm like, surprise, it's me. Remember me? I have a new record. And he was fortunately interested in putting it out, and then that process takes a while. And now here we finally are in 2025, and that's why it took so long. Even the story takes forever to tell. So but that's for those wondering, many things had to occur, and that's a short list of them. So
I want to ask one thing about that period when Gina left and you were there. I mean, it pretty clear it was the motivation for you to get this thing done in order to go full circle, release a new record by Weeping Sores, as the initial injury occurred during the first full length. How was your mental state at that point?
You mean in that stretch in 2023 when I was
no, yeah, exactly. When it was up in the air, not knowing what to do.
Yeah, that was a tough time for me, frankly. I don't want to get too much into what happened in terms of Gina leaving the band, but let's
only focus on your mental state.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely going through it. I had been working on this really hard for a long time. It's very effortful process. I'm not, frankly, an amazing instrumental musician. That's not really my forte. And Weeping Sores is it's relatively demanding material. It's not super easy to play. So I had to work really, really hard on the record, and the thought of, and also it had this very profound emotional significance for me as the thing that I used to drag myself out of the state of frankly, the state of incapacity and like disability that I was in at the beginning of the process. And so the prospect of just canning that, just like throwing that work away, it really did not make me feel good. But I also was in a place where I was like, well, this is always going to be colored by the fact that we had an initial vision for it that we could not complete, right? That's always going to be, it's going to be like a scarred record, like permanently. And there's nothing that you can do about that after that juncture, right? So I was really torn. I really was, I kind of just couldn't think about it for a while. Like after we removed all the violin tracks and I was like, well, what do we do now? Like I couldn't listen to it. I couldn't play the parts on guitar. I actually kind of stopped playing guitar again for a while because I was like, I was just too broken up about it. So it was really only because other people encouraged me to pursue it that I ever picked it up again. Like I was leaning towards just scrapping it. And that would have been a big emotional blow to me. I probably would have just given up on being that type of musician. I'd be like, well, like no more guitar. I'm just a vocalist now. And so that was difficult. And that's kind of the second difficult phase of this record too, because like my mental state at the beginning when I was still like, my shoulder was in such bad shape, like that was a really tough time for me because anyone who's ever had a significant disabling injury knows like it affects every area of your life. And so at that juncture, I kind of was in the second state of exception with this record. And like, it was very painful. Like it sucked. And I'm very glad that I had the people around me. And like, I should also mention that Caroline encouraged me to pursue it still. Yeah. And she especially, she knew pretty firsthand, like how much I've been working on it. Cause like literally sitting here playing guitar, she's often like in that room over there, like hearing it. So like she heard like the hours and hours of practice I put in for it. And so, I'm very grateful that those people were willing to push me to keep going with it. And then there's also like a certain amount of emotional vulnerability that's involved in saying like, hey, yeah, like, I made this record with like functionally somebody else in mind. Like, are you comfortable jumping in here? And like, I also want to be clear that I didn't write all the new arrangements. Like the way that this band works is I write my parts, give people suggestions for like the premise of what they're playing, but I don't like write the parts. So there's also a certain amount of trust of being like, okay, some new people need to come into this realm and contribute in a way where I'm not really in control of what they're doing. I'm kind of just like giving direction at a high level. And I was fortunate that I had people who seemed like they were worthy of trust in that way, who were able to do it. So yeah, it took some. I had to spend a lot of time meditating on it in order to get to the point of like wanting to pursue it still, and then kind of deciding what to do. Mm-hmm. And then there's also a lot of just like logistics and organization that were involved in doing that. So it's a big
cruise.
Right, exactly, right. Like I had to. We were emailing back and forth, and she's like, "Yeah, like she's like in the Southern Pacific, and like talking about the parts and stuff like that." So, so yeah, just a very surreal experience. Like really, like a journey. Like a lot of stuff happened, even though so much of the time I spent just sitting in this room. I felt like it feels like there was a big journey involved. So. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry.
It does. It totally does. It totally does. Last question before we come to the infamous goodbye round. The title track, 14 minutes and a few seconds. I didn't write down how many seconds. It's like obviously the opus magnum on the record. It's, as you said, the longest track you've ever written. Why did you put it at the end? Like it's the centerpiece of a record. Why not?
I thought about that a lot. There's kind of a bunch of different reasons why it ended up there. That mostly have to do with the overall structure of the record and like what would be done to the other songs by the placement of that song, right? Because that song really is just like this wail, right? The kind of like just like when you have a monster song like that, and that's not like the only. If you're not just like a 15-minute song band, some bands just like that's all the songs. But a band like this, where there's, a variety of different song types essentially on the record, you have to kind of think about what the listener will be feeling, before that song, after that song, and that kind of thing. And so basically what I reasoned was that like I didn't feel like I could just put it in the middle of the record because like then afterwards it just kind of like makes this lopsided experience, right? Where like the normal song, gigantic song, and then like a normal song.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's like kind of weird. So I didn't want to do that. So the question then became, does it open the record or does it close the record? And at that juncture, I was like, well, you know, the emotional tenor of that song is so strained and it reaches such like a when it gets like the finally this like big climax at the very end of the song, you know, like that is really like the highest level of density and like sort of physical intensity of the entire record, I feel like. And the song has like this it's like this really personal thing for me, right? Because like that was the song. The lyrics of that song are also like explicitly about like the recovery process and like my attempt to fix my shoulder, which, as the song says, it really still is not the same. There's things that I used to be able to do that I cannot do anymore. Like I don't lift weights anymore, really. Like that I still kind of avoid doing. And so it has like this very, like, it's still like a painful experience for me just to hear it. And it's like, well, I can't open the record with this because it's like this, you know.
Where do you go afterwards?
Right, exactly. It's like everything will feel like a letdown after that, right? So, and also I had this idea for the ending, like the way at the end of that song, like the metal band fades out and then there's like the other elements or what's left. That seemed like just a compelling way to end a record. And so I ended up putting it at the end. And then the other consideration that was going into this is that the album is basically arranged in reverse chronological order of when I wrote the songs, right? Like the opening song, Arctic Summer, was the song that I wrote last, and et cetera, right? Like in reverse throughout the record. And there's something about that even though that's not really an audience-facing piece of information, because like no one's going to know that unless they like watch this interview, right?
Exactly, which they all should.
That's why they should watch the interview, exactly. But like basically, there was something to me that appealed, as you said earlier, like a full circle moment, right? Like you know, I went through all of this process, and then like I'm kind of, you know, at the end of the process of creating the album, I'm looking back at it, and like, you know, there like that is how things happen in reverse, right? I'm looking backwards and I see it like, you know, as the songs go, it gets further and further away from the present time and closer to the moment at which the concept for the record was initialized. And I like committed to this process of like, okay, I need to be able to play guitar again. I'm not going to give up on that. How am I going to motivate myself? Well, the only way I've ever been able to motivate myself to play guitar consistently is by writing music. And so, there's something that just on, you could say a spiritual level appeals to me about the album being structured that way. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, there's also like, you have to consider vinyl side breaks and stuff like that. So there's some other, you know, there's some crap like that where it's like, well, you can only arrange the album when there's only 5 songs and like you have to have 2 like 19 to 23 minute chunks. Like that kind of limits your options. So yeah, a bunch of factors kind of all fed into this. It felt like a decision had been made for me more than I made it myself, right? Like, it's like, well, it has to be this way. There's no other way they could possibly be. So that's kind of, it felt unconscious, but there was like a bunch of different things you can point to as like the proximate reasons.
So, Doug, first of all, thanks for all the insight into the new record, Weeping Sores. And I still hope that you're going to bring it to stages, hopefully in Europe at some time. If not, then I can totally see that. But you know how it goes, the infamous quickfire round, you don't get around it. So I'll start with something simple. I'll start with Disembowelment, and I'll give you their 2 basic only releases. The Dusk EP versus Transcendence into the Peripheral. Which one would you rather listen to right now?
Definitely the LP. That's a great record. I mean, Disembowelment in general, like, I don't actually listen to a ton of Death Doom. Like, I listen to some of it. A lot of the influences in Weeping Sores are either just regular death metal bands or like doom and sludge bands that don't really have a death metal component. But that album is fucking amazing. Like, that's like as far as that kind of music goes, that's about as good as it gets, I think. So Dusk is good too, but that LP just has something magical about it. Yeah.
Let's make it a little bit more difficult. Wetwind's Ende versus Portal.
Ooh, okay. Well, I love both of those bands. The thing about Vedwed's End is there's only the one record, really, right? So, whereas Portal has a lot of records, so I think that they kind of just win by default because there's a lot of Portal records that I love. Mm-hmm. What I would say is that if you kind of said like Carl Michael Eide material versus Portal, that would be tough, right? Because he's a bunch of his bands. Like I love Virus, I love the Dode Heimsgard records that he's on. He was kind of peripherally involved in Code, a band that I love. Like those first two Code records, he wrote some lyrics for them. So like when you stack that up against Portal, that becomes very challenging for me. Yeah. But just versus Vedwed's End, I have to go with Portal because they have a longer track record.
So let's go a little bit more into the Doom area. The record was mastered by Greg Chandler. So I'll give you two esoteric records.
Okay.
A Pyrrhic Existence, you see what I did there, versus The Pernicious Enigma.
That's a tough one.
I never said they should be easy.
I would say probably Pernicious Enigma. Those are both sick records. My favorite esoteric would be Maniacal Veil. So that would be an easy win. But yeah, I'm going to go with Pernicious Enigma for this one.
Evoken, a band that I've also seen compared, or that I've also often seen Weeping Sores compared to. I'll give you two Evoken records. Shade of Night Descending versus Quietus.
Yeah, so Evoken actually is one of the few Death Doom bands that directly influence Weeping Sores. Like that one, like that's, people always say My Dying Bride. Not really influenced by My Dying Bride, but I am pretty influenced by Evoken. And I'm going to say Quietus for this one. That was one of the first, like I got into them through that album and Antithesis of Light. So those are like both really near and dear to my heart. So
I don't know why, but there is sometimes, especially on the last track, the whole thing has a certain kind of gothic, doomy, peaceful kind feeling to me. So I'll give you two of the most important peaceful bands ever. Anathema versus Paradise Lost.
Oof. God, that's a tough one. I'm gonna say Anathema, I guess. I feel like kind of down the stretch, I like what Anathema did more. But the proper era, like Death Doom, Paradise Lost stuff, I think I would probably pick that in a vacuum. But considering the overall catalog, I would say Anathema. So
okay. I'll give you two of the probably most famous extreme doom bands of all time. Also because they share members, at least a few of them. Sun versus Khanate.
I'm seeing Khanate in like a couple days. They're playing here in 2 days. And I've seen Sun recently. I actually saw Sun like in a fancy classical music venue recently. They played at the Lincoln Center. It was a very bizarre experience. Yeah. Yeah, right.
Is it still standing?
Barely. I mean, that was a very funny experience because there's a bunch of people there who like were Sun fans. And then there were people there who just like have a subscription to the Lincoln Center, like 60-year-old Upper West Siders who did not know what they were getting into. Like you can just watch those people like gradually flee the room during the set. It was really funny. But yeah, I guess I would go with Khanate. I listen to Khanate more on record than I listen to Sun. Sun is like an incredible live experience, and I do like the records, but like without the physical force of, the amps, basically, it's not quite the same. Whereas I feel like with Khanate, like the studio experience, like encapsulates more of what the band is about, right? Yeah. Like it gets closer to like what you would see live. Whereas I feel like
what you hear is what you get.
Right, exactly. With Sun, like it's a different experience because it's like a feeling in your body as much as anything. Yeah. Right. So, and because like, I've been lucky enough to see Sun like quite a number of times at this point. But the majority of times that I'm hearing these bands is on record, right? So, because of that, I would say Khanate.
and to show that also the extreme metal guys like some kind of funny music flicks, I chose to end this with two of my all-time favorite music movies: High Fidelity versus Almost Famous.
Almost Famous. I love Almost Famous. That's like one of my favorite movies.
Okay.
Just in terms of like the encapsulation of like the ridiculousness of being in a rock band. Like a lot of that movie is just like seeing the musicians be assholes essentially. And also kind of like how like degrading it, even for like a big popular, like, you know, they're supposed to be a popular band, right? Like it's the golden age of rock music. So like there's groupies, they're getting lots of money and drugs and all this stuff. And like, you just see them be shitheads. And, you know, one thing that you can say for all levels of music is that like there's just lots of shitheads running around saying stupid stuff. And like to me, like the way that was captured in that movie is just I think about it all the time. Like the scene where they get the T-shirts and they have the argument about like, oh, I'm just one of the out of focus guys. That shit. Like, I still bring up jokes from that movie like 20 years after having seen it the first time. It's like it's an amazing movie. I like High Fidelity too, but I never worked in a record store, so I don't have that experience of like being the record store guy. Whereas like I have, you know, been on tour a lot and been in bands a lot, so that feels like closer to my experience of music. You know.
Yeah. Well, for me, it would be High Fidelity, even though I never regularly worked at a record store, but I helped out at record stores in my life. And I just like the idea of, you know, putting everything into a top 5 of this, a top 5 of that.
I mean, as a former like music writer, I definitely related to that part of it as well, right? Like the kind of like the fan culture part of it, and like the lists and like the obsession with like rarities and stuff like that. Like, yeah, I don't want to say that I don't like High Fidelity, especially actually I like the novel version a lot, like the original, the Nick Hornby novel.
Yeah.
And of course, in the movie, like there's the amazing Jack Black performance as like the character's name, like Rich, I think the character's name might be. I can't remember, but
yeah, I think he's Rich. One of the two is either him or the other one is Rich. Yeah.
It's one of the best Jack Black roles, I would say. So yeah, so great movies, but for me, it's clear cut. It's Almost Famous.
So we can't agree on everything, but we should all agree on the fact that you should listen to the new Weeping Sores record, the Convalescence Agonies, because it's just a great record. Check it out. It came out on May 30th on Voigthanger Records, and I can only suggest to listen to that one. So, Doug, thanks for joining. Your chance for final last words.
Well, first, I would just say, Thorsten, thank you so much for having me back. It's always a real pleasure to chat with you. I love doing these interviews. As far as Weeping Sores stuff, we are currently waiting on the CD pressing to land in the States. I know that Voigthanger has it for sale already, and then there is a vinyl version of the album coming that should be available by the end of July. We're hoping that it's going to be kind of like mid-July, and this is a band where I think that the vinyl format is going to be the best way to hear it. So I encourage people to check it out that way if they can.
Totally agree on that one. So I know you got to run for the rehearsal, so enjoy the rest of your day, my friend.
Likewise, man. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.